This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
But because the Communist Party is still in power, so people still understand the potential danger if you recall the sufferings in the Cultural Revolution period. Through so many political movements, Chinese people already start to unwillingly learn how to forget things, not to mention, those bad memories to the younger generation.
Hello and welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. Today we finish off our series on the Soviet Union. In previous episodes, we discussed how the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, how Soviet leaders used the arts to further their communist goals, and we also talked about the infamous Soviet Gulag system. The Soviet Union was the first major communist regime, and it didn't waste any time in trying to export communism to other parts of the world. Although the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, there are still 5 communist countries today: China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the biggest threat to the United States. Now it's China, another communist country. But how did China grow to accept Marxism, a European ideology? And how did China, with its traditions promoting harmony among people, embrace class struggle? Today we welcome back China expert Sean Lin. We'll discuss how China eventually accepted communism, how Chinese communism differed from Soviet communism, and how their relationship eventually broke down. Here's my conversation with Sean Lin. Sean, thanks for joining us.
Jess, thank you for inviting me.
So how did communism get accepted in China? Marxism is pretty much the opposite of traditional Chinese values.
So at the end of late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, China was in a transition period. It was at the end of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in China, and then it transited into a different militia period in China, and then finally the Kuomintang united China in the 1920s. So during this period, there are so many frustrations in the China society because at the end of Qing dynasty, it was particularly corrupted. People seeking different way out, and also in China at the time, people already exposed to the Western culture, and so they will try to see whether they can learn something from the Western civilization. Like in Qing dynasty, the emperor Kangxi and Qianlong, they do invite some of the Western scholars to be advisors for the royal court. People try to see whether they can still stick to the Chinese culture, Chinese traditions, but they can learn from the Western culture. So during this period of time, so many different philosophies and theories being spread into China, including social reforms, democratic systems, ideologies, and as well total liberalisms, evolutions. All these concepts got imported into China, translated into Chinese language. So many intellectuals start to learn these different thinkings from the Western society. So at the beginning, when the communism was spread into China, people actually feel it was quite foreign because one fundamental that the communists advocate was class struggle. Well, in China for 2,000 years, although there are different social status, but Chinese society was not clearly separated by different level of classes. It's not like in India or other countries. Definitely, there's no strict confrontation between so-called proletariat and also with the bourgeoisies. There's no such different classes and also a strong confrontation in China. So it's a very foreign concept actually to advocate class struggles and through revolutions, through violent revolutions to gain power. So at the beginning, people may not be able to accept this communism in China. However, the revolution in Russia actually let some of the intellectuals in China realize maybe even through this kind of extreme ideology and through violent revolution, they can establish a new political system. You can say Soviet Union become a new example. So people were thinking maybe we can try to see whether we can have a proletariat dictatorship in China and learn from the Russia experience. So at the time, one of the scholars, his name is Chai He-sen. He's one of the earliest communist promoters in China, and he also one of the founder for the Chinese Communist Party. So he said, maybe the working classes in China can also be enlightened. They can see the effectiveness in the Soviet Union, and maybe Chinese people can find some common thread in Marxisms or Leninisms in Chinese culture. So that's why some of the intellectuals now try to think how they can use the Leninisms and promote it in China.
So how did the general public grow to accept communism?
So at the first, only a very small group of the intellectuals in China accept the concept of a proletariat dictatorship. But in order to let this ideology can be accepted by a majority of Chinese people in China, so it has to do some reform or adjustment of these ideologies. So the key issue is how to let the Chinese people, especially the farmers, accepting this ideology. Because in China, even the big cities, they don't have a big working class working in the industries. Because China has been an agriculture-focused society for a long, long time. And it's a very stable systems. And people in all classes, they're basically following the Confucianism, which emphasizing the harmonies between different social class, following the loyalties to the emperors, as well as how to harmonize with your neighbors, your family clans, how to stick together, support families together. So many of these concepts keep the society very stable. There's no class struggle or fighting between the different classes. So it's very difficult to adopt every measures from the Soviet Union and thinking that in the city you can actually organize workers to fight with the governments. The power is not enough. So at the time, Mao Zedong, he tried different ways. He also at the beginning, adopting the Soviet Union models, he organized workers' strikes in the cities, but he didn't see it's a very successful model. And he also realized the communist ideology very hard to survive, even though they try to establish a government inside China, a separate government, basically modeling the Soviet Union. But it's very hard. And in the 1930s, the Soviet government in Jiangxi province that the Chinese Communist Party established was actually besieged by the Kuomintang militaries for 4 or 5 times. Because it's a totally separatism inside China, right? Because you establish a government inside China different from the main government, the Kuomintang governments, and you receive funding from the Soviet Union, and you following the sort of Soviet Union's ideology. At the time, Kuomintang called the Communist Party as a gangsters because they kill many farmers and kill many intellectuals, even in those areas that they controlled. So how can communist ideology be accepted by more people? It's very hard. So at the time, Mao Zedong realized he has to do adjustment. He want to let more farmers accepting the communist ideologies. So that's why he later on, he focused on to work in the countryside. So he chose regions that are bordering, like for example, 3 provinces. So it's kind of remote area for the different provincial government, very hard to control this remote site. So he chose this site and then advocate the communist ideology to the farmers and intentionally stimulate the conflict between the farmers and the landowners. Because most of the farmers at the time, they leasing the lands from big landowners or medium-sized landowners. So they work for them to support their own families. But at the time, it was harmonious relationship, not necessarily exploitation like the communists advocates. Mao Zedong stimulate the conflict and then encourage the farmers to fight with the landlords, even through violence, even kill the landlords. So intensify the conflict between farmers and the landowners. So create an opportunity for the communist ideology to further accept it by more people in the countryside. And they use violence to take away the land from the landowners and then redistribute it to the farmers, saying, see, we as communists, we help the farmers, right? We help these poorest farmers. We take the land from the rich people and then we give you properties, let you have land to work on. So in this way, they gradually be accepted by some of the farmers because they become immediate beneficiaries from the violent revolution in the countryside. So that's one of the main things that Mao Zedong advocate in the countryside. So this revolution is very different from the Soviet Union one, because Soviet Union is a revolution in the city, right? Take the power directly. But Mao Zedong used a different strategy. So basically use besiege strategy. So he used the countryside as his foundation. He tried to make a revolution successful in the countryside and then use this strategy to besiege the main cities and then gradually take power in the cities. Also, during this period of time, Mao Zedong still consulting, or you can say following the guidance from the Soviet Union all the time. And Soviet Union also sent delegates, or you can say the organization called the Communist International also repeatedly sent delegates to China to give orders. Sometimes they call it guidance, but basically it's orders from the Soviet Union regarding how they can execute the revolutions in China.
So they were successful in the countryside, and they were still following orders from the Soviet Union up until and even during World War II?
Yes. When the Japanese invaded China, Communist Party decided to join to defend China against the Japanese invasion, because actually the Communist Party received an order from Soviet Union saying you need to protect the Soviet Union, because at the time the Soviet Union was afraid that if Japan took over the Manchurian area, the next step maybe they can even invade the Soviet Union from the east, right, from the Far East side. So Soviet Union didn't want to fight on two fronts. On the west, they fight Germany. On the east, the fight with Japan will be very challenging. So that's why Soviet Union gave order to the Chinese Communist Party saying, at this moment, you need to unite with Kuomintang, try to deal with the invasion from Japan. So at least you can buffer Japan's potential invasion into Soviet Union. So that's actually the direct order from the Soviet Union. So Communist Party was not actually fighting for the Chinese people. They are fighting to protect the Soviet Union. That's a fundamental difference.
Coming up next, Mao's strategy to take over China. Welcome back. We have China expert Sean Lin here with us. We're talking about how communism took hold in China. So Marxist ideology is quite different from traditional Chinese culture, and what worked in the Soviet Union wasn't necessarily going to work in China, especially because of the popularity of the nationalist KMT government right after World War II. So Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong came up with a strategy. Could you tell us about that?
Okay, so if we skip the World War II period and also the Civil War period, right? So we just talk about, for example, how communism in China was different from Soviet Union, because Mao Zedong did realize China's situation is complicated, and after the World War II and the Kuomintang, the KMT's reputation in China was so high, it's very hard for them to ignore the impacts, and so they cannot immediately saying we want to have a political system that's just one party. So in 1945, Mao Zedong made a speech in the Communist Party's the 7th Congress for the Communist Party. In his report, he highlighted that after defeating the Japan, the fundamental political strategy for the Chinese Communist Party should be to establish a democratic political system that can unite the different classes. And the working class should take the main leadership. And he called it the new democratic political system. And he tried to make it quite unique for the Chinese people, quite different from the Soviet Union system. And because he realized this concept probably is easier to accept in China. And so in 1948, Mao Zedong also emphasizing in one of his articles saying that even though in Leninism, it was highlighting about the proletariat dictatorship. But in China, we want to establish people's democratic dictatorship. It's very interesting. It's called people's democratic dictatorship. So he want to add this term "people's" in front of the democratic dictatorship. So he adding this concept so that he feel like people won't be strongly against a dictatorship because it's people's dictatorship, and it's not just about Communist Party because it's a democratic system. So he using these different strategies as a way for the Communist Party to easily win more support. But this was not just Mao Zedong's innovation. Historical record actually showing that Mao Zedong actually report his suggestions, his innovation to Stalin, and Stalin was also quite supportive for his strategies. And Mao Zedong actually claimed that he's always a student for Stalin. He also need approval from the Soviet Union in order for him to apply these strategies. So later on, I think there are political leaders in Soviet Union also agree the so-called people's democratic dictatorship or the political country system is actually serving the role of proletariat dictatorship, even though it's called people's democratic dictatorship, because the leadership of the political power is still in the Communist Party. So no matter how they call it, the nature is still the Communist Party in charge of all other political parties that are engaged in this united government. So it's actually very interesting to see how the Chinese Communist Party worked together with the Soviet Union, with Stalin, to decide the strategies in China.
So by that time, the Soviet Union had been in control for several decades, but popularity for communism was still growing in China. So did any news about the Soviet atrocities or the Soviet gulags reach China? Were they worried about that at all? Or was Mao's strategy of putting the word democratic in there fix everything?
I don't think Chinese people at the time know so much about the atrocities happened in Soviet Union period, because the Communist Party was very good at propaganda. They following the Soviet Union's propaganda systems, so they decided what the people can receive, what kind of information they can receive. The Communist Party basically, is actually copying what the Soviet Union do to the Soviet Union people. So that's why I think in the 1940s, 1950s, even before the Soviet Union and Chinese Communist Party kind of break down on their relationship, before that, there's no criticism on Soviet Union at all. So everyone in China at that time, they had to take the education and kind of appreciate the Soviet Union as a big brother to the Chinese people. So China was learning the industrial technologies and social management system all from the Soviet Union. So that's why people didn't know all the dark side in the Soviet Union. There's no way they can know the Gulag exists in Soviet Union. No way they know. There's no way the Chinese people will get the information that millions of people die in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. All this. So this information only exposed to the Chinese people after the 1970s, after the Cultural Revolution ended, and the Chinese society was gradually more open up, and then some of the information started to leak into the Chinese society. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, more people start to know about the Gulag. So it's very hard for Chinese people to know what is actually going on in the Soviet Union.
Coming up, China goes its own way. Welcome back. We have China expert Sean Lin here with us, and we're talking about how communism entered China. So, the Chinese Communist Party was following orders from the Soviet Union during World War II and even after they took power in 1949. But eventually there was a rift between the two. Could you tell us what happened?
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party broke down their relationship with the Soviet Union. It's also triggered by the political climate change in the Soviet Union, because, like in 1956, so the Soviet Union Communist Party, they started to criticize the personal worship for Stalin. So at the time, the Soviet Union Communist Party started to take Stalin down from like a deity position, so like everyone had to worship Stalin. But after 1956, they started to criticize Stalin, so people started to treat him as a normal person. And at the time, Mao Zedong in China realized this is a threat to his own personal power. Because at the time, in the 1956, right, in the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party's eighth Congress, Chinese Communist Party have to recognize the Soviet Union's action against Stalin, because they have to show the world, at least the Communist Party in different countries still united together. So they have to recognize, it's good to be against the personal worship and still stick to a democratic principle inside the Communist Party. But Mao Zedong definitely did not feel comfortable in his heart. So he had to do additional changing in the Communist Party's strategies. And so he had to emphasizing that the so-called socialism democracies need to emphasizing that the power need to be centralized. So he used the word centralized. So you don't use the word personal worship. He say the power need to be centralized. So Mao Zedong tried to avoid that the Chinese Communist Party also initiate a wave of criticism against the top leadership that would threaten his own power. That's why he tuned down, and he even pretend to do a self-criticisms. But at the same time, he using different tactic to take down other political rivals in the Chinese Communist Party. And it's widely believed, even for him to initiate the 10 years Chinese Cultural Revolution, at the beginning, who he was trying to take down Liu Shaoqi, who was actually the president of the whole country at the time. Because Mao Zedong feel that the Liu Shaoqi actually threatened his own power, so he decided to take down Liu Shaoqi, and through cultural revolutions and by mobilizing the young students to fight against power, fight against authorities. And so Mao Zedong was actually promoted as the genius for the 20th centuries, and kind of as influential as Lenin in China in the Cultural Revolution. So actually in the Cultural Revolution period, Mao Zedong's it's like mighty gods. Any words, any simple expression that he made, everyone in China have to learn, have to follow his words. It's ridiculous. It's nationwide phenomena to like worship Mao Zedong. So it's a dramatic change in the society when Mao highly promoted his own personal, very esteemed status in the society.
So, we interviewed a lady who grew up in the Soviet Union, and she has no records of her great grandparents, their names, or when they were born. And she said that she had asked her grandma about her grandma's parents, and her grandma said, "We don't have any of that information. Never ask me that again." And then she asked her mom last week about it, and her mom said the same thing, which was, "We don't have any records or names or dates about your great grandparents, and never ask me that question ever again." So that was kind of interesting to me. I was just wondering if that kind of thing happened in China too.
I think overall in Chinese society, because the Communist Party is still in power, even after the Cultural Revolution, and it was a clear failure from the Communist Party's so-called experiment in the society. But because the Communist Party is still in power, so people still understand the potential danger if you recall the sufferings in the Cultural Revolution period. And through so many political movements, Chinese people already start to kind of unwillingly learn how to forget things, not to mention, those bad memories to the younger generation. People had to find a way they can continue their life. So a lot of people selectively choose not to mention what happened in the past. They just look into the future saying, hopefully future will be better. It's just similar like what happened after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, right? Many people start to think, all right, from now on, I just won't engage in any of the political affairs in China. I'll just think about my own life, how to make myself rich, and let's not talk about politics. So many of the adults do not even mention about the massacre to their kids. So that's also one of the main reasons nowadays a lot of kids don't know anything about the Tiananmen massacre. And it's not just because the textbook in China don't mention about it, because in families, the adults choose to not to mention it. And similar, and for the Cultural Revolution, for many of the family sufferings in China, many people just still in their heart, they feel about the Communist Party's revenge, and they don't want to mention it to avoid the danger, and also as a way they can continue their life in China. So it's a very sad situation, but they happen like that.
Well, Sean, thanks so much for being here.
Jess, thank you for inviting me.
What did you think of our series on Soviet communism? Stay tuned for our next series on the United Nations. You might be shocked by what we have to tell you about its history and what's behind some of its biggest initiatives. Once again, I'm Jessica Beatty. Thanks for listening to America Daily. Until next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.